The letter had arrived on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday, the entire Hale household had rearranged itself around the crisis of its contents. Lawrence Drayton, the sixth Duke of Fenmore, had written to Sir Gilbert Hale requesting permission to call upon his eldest daughter, Lucinda, with the express purpose of discussing a formal arrangement between their families. The letter was measured, courteous, written in the hand of a man who understood precisely what he was offering and expected the gravity of that offer to be understood in return. Sir Gilbert had read it aloud at breakfast. Lady Hale had pressed her napkin to her mouth. Lucinda had set down her teacup and said, with the calm that made her the most admired woman in 3 counties, that she would not receive him. The silence that followed was of the variety that restructures a family. Lucinda's reasons were her own, though Francis had long suspected their shape. There was a Captain Aldous stationed at Plymouth, a second son with excellent teeth and no fortune, whose letters arrived with a regularity that suggested something well beyond casual correspondence. Lucinda said no, and no amount of Sir Gilbert's pacing or Lady Hale's quiet weeping altered the word by a single syllable. But a duke could not be refused by silence. Someone had to go to Fenmore Park and say what the rest of the family could not bring themselves to say. They sent Frances. She was the second daughter, the practical one, the one whose talents ran to household ledgers and herbal remedies rather than watercolors and Italian arias. Her hair was brown where Lucinda's was gold. Her figure was slight where Lucinda's was statuesque. She had been presented during the season 3 years ago and had danced adequately and been invited nowhere twice. This was not a source of grief. Frances had made her accommodation with the world early. She was useful, she was sensible, she was loved in the way that reliable things are loved, and she would likely marry a curate or a solicitor, or perhaps not at all. She did not mind this. She had stopped minding it at 17, which was the year Lucinda had been painted in oils, and Frances had been asked to hold the artist's turpentine. The carriage brought her to Fenmore Park on a Thursday morning in early May. The drive was long and lined with lime trees, whose leaves had not yet reached their full summer weight, and the light that fell through them was pale and trembling, the kind of light that makes everything it touches look provisional. The house itself was larger than she had expected, not grand in the overwrought fashion of some estates, but wide and settled into its grounds with the confidence of a building that had stood for 200 years and intended to stand for 200 more, stone the color of warm bread, windows catching the morning. A portico with columns that were Doric, she noted, not Corinthian, restrained, classical, correct. Frances smoothed her dress, dove gray muslin, her second best because nobody had thought to offer her Lucinda's, and stepped down from the carriage with her speech composed in her mind like a letter she had already sealed. The butler showed her to a drawing room on the south side of the house. Tall windows, pale yellow silk on the walls, a fireplace with a mantel of carved Portland stone on which stood a single clock and nothing else. The room was immaculate and somehow also inhabited, a book face down on the arm of a chair, a pair of riding gloves on the console table, a cup of tea gone cold beside the window. Someone lived in this room, not merely received guests in it. She was standing by the window, examining the garden, a parterre laid out in precise geometric beds, the boxwood clipped to the inch, when the door opened and the Duke of Fenmore entered. He was not what she had prepared for. She had imagined someone older, or at least someone whose bearing would make his age irrelevant, a man of consequence who moved like consequence. Lawrence Drayton was perhaps 30, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a face that would have been handsome if it had been arranged for the purpose, but was not. He had the look of someone who had just come from doing something else and was not yet fully arrived. His coat was good, but not new. His boots were clean, but had been cleaned many times. He carried no air of ceremony, and when he saw her standing in his drawing room, a woman he had never met, in a gray dress with the light behind her, he stopped in the doorway with his hand still on the handle and looked at her with an expression she could not immediately classify. Not confusion, not displeasure, something more like attention. "Miss Hale," the butler announced and withdrew. Frances curtsied. She had rehearsed this. 10 minutes, polite refusal, leave. "Your Grace," she said, "I am Frances Hale. I have come on behalf of my family to deliver a message regarding your letter to my father." He came into the room. He did not sit. He stood near the fireplace with one hand on the mantel and regarded her with the same unclassifiable attention, as though she were a sentence he had not finished reading. "You are not Lucinda," he said. It was not a question. "No," I am her sister. Her younger sister. Yes. A pause. He removed his hand from the mantel and clasped both hands behind his back, the posture of a man preparing to listen. And the message? Frances delivered it cleanly, the way she delivered everything, without ornament, without apology beyond what courtesy required. Her sister was deeply sensible of the honor. Her sister held his grace in the highest regard. Her sister, with the greatest regret, was unable to accept his proposal of courtship for reasons that were personal and which the family hoped he would understand without requiring elaboration. She said all of this standing very straight, meeting his eyes, which were gray-green and disquietingly steady, and she said it in under 2 minutes. And when she finished, she folded her hands and waited for the conversation to end. It did not end. "May I ask," the Duke said, "whether your sister's refusal is on grounds of character or attachment?" Frances hesitated. Lucinda's attachment to Captain Aldous was not hers to disclose. "I am not at liberty to say, Your Grace, only that the refusal is firm and kindly meant." "Kindly meant," he repeated, as though tasting the words. "Sit down, Miss Hale. I should not stay. The carriage is waiting." "The carriage can wait. The horses are being watered. I watched them led to the stable yard from the upstairs window." He gestured to the chair opposite his. "Sit down. I should like to understand something." She sat. She did not know why she sat, except that the instruction had been delivered with such uncomplicated authority that refusing it would have required more explanation than obeying it. He sat opposite her. The cold tea was between them on its saucer, and he glanced at it and rang the bell. "You have come alone," he observed. "My mother considered it unnecessary to accompany me for a refusal." "And your father?" "My father is not comfortable with refusals. He is more suited to acceptances." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite amusement but adjacent to it. A maid entered, and he ordered fresh tea without breaking his gaze from Frances, and when the maid left he said, "Tell me about your sister." "Which aspect?" "The aspect that prevents her from accepting an offer that would make her a duchess." Frances regarded him carefully. He was not wounded. She had expected wounded pride, the tight jaw, the cool withdrawal, but there was none of it. He was curious, genuinely, almost scientifically curious, in the manner of a man who had presented a hypothesis and found it disproved and wanted to understand the mechanism of the disproof. "Lucinda knows her own mind," Frances said. "She always has. It is one of her more formidable qualities." "And what are her less formidable qualities?" "She has none. She is, I'm reliably informed, perfect in every particular." The thing at the corner of his mouth deepened. "You are her sister, and you say this without warmth." "I say it with great warmth. I also say it with accuracy. Lucinda is beautiful, accomplished, kind, and entirely certain of what she wants. I admire her tremendously. I also know that she would rather marry a man she has chosen than a man who has chosen her, and I think—" She stopped. She had said more than she intended. The room was too comfortable and his attention too direct, and she had spoken as though to a friend rather than to a duke. "You think what, Miss Hale?" "I think she is right," Frances said quietly, "and I think you would agree with her if you knew the whole of it." The tea arrived. He poured it himself, which surprised her. He poured it well, without ceremony, and handed her a cup with a saucer, and did not ask how she took it, because he had noticed, she would realize this later, that she had glanced at the sugar bowl and away from it, which meant she did not take sugar, and he had registered this in the time it took to lift the pot. She should have left after the tea. She intended to leave after the tea, but he asked her about the garden. He had noticed her looking at it through the window, and she said something about the parterre being unusually formal for a country house, and he said his mother had designed it before she died, and he had not had the heart to change it, and she said that was not sentiment, that was good design, because the bones of it were classical and would outlast any fashion, and he looked at her as though she had said something extraordinary, when she had said nothing extraordinary at all. 20 minutes became 40. 40 became an hour, and iwi and unsort. The tea cooled in its pot, and then more was brought, and at some point she realized she had removed her gloves and was holding the cup with bare hands, and the light had moved from the east windows to the south windows, and the room was warmer, and she was speaking with more ease than she had spoken to anyone outside her own household in years. He asked about her life, not the polite inquiries of the drawing room, not, "Do you play?" and "Have you been to Bath?" but real questions. What she read, what she thought of the new enclosures, Whether she had opinions on estate management, which she did because she had been managing her father's book since she was 15, though she did not say it that way. She said she had some experience with household economies, and he said, "You are being modest in a way that does not suit you, Miss Hale." And she laughed, actually laughed, and then stopped because she heard her own laughter in this room and did not recognize it. "I should go," she said, and stood. "I have delivered my message and stayed well beyond what propriety permits. You have been very gracious, Your Grace." He stood. He was taller than she had calculated. The sitting had obscured it. He stood and looked at her with the same expression he had worn in the doorway, the expression she still could not classify, but which she was beginning, with some alarm, to suspect she understood. "Miss Hale, would you permit me to call upon your family?" "You are welcome to call, though if you intend to press your suit with Lucinda—" "I do not intend to press my suit with Lucinda." The sentence landed in the room like a stone in still water. Frances felt the circles of it reach her, felt them arrive at the edges of something she had not known was there. "Then I do not understand the purpose of the call," she said, though she did. She understood it perfectly. She simply could not permit herself to understand it, because understanding it would mean reorganizing everything she had settled about herself, every accommodation, every measured piece. "I think you do understand," he said, "but I will not press the point today." She left. The carriage ride home took 40 minutes, and she spent every one of them staring at the passing hedgerows with her gloves still in her hand, unworn, forgotten. He called the following Tuesday. He was shown into the morning room where the entire Hale family had assembled with the desperate composure of people who did not know what was about to happen. Lucinda sat by the window in a dress of pale blue silk that caught the light like water. Lady Hale had arranged the room to its best advantage. Sir Gilbert stood by the fireplace in his good coat. Frances sat in the corner with her needlework. The Duke greeted them all with appropriate formality. He accepted tea. He complimented the room, which was, in truth, a modest room made presentable through Lady Hale's determined management. He asked Sir Gilbert about the estate, and listened with the attentive patience of a man who understood land. He spoke briefly with Lucinda, who was gracious and measured and exactly as perfect as Frances had described. He admired the watercolor above the mantel, which was Lucinda's, and asked about the book on the side table, which was Frances's, and when Frances said it was a treatise on soil drainage that she had borrowed from the circulating library, Lady Hale closed her eyes. He stayed an hour. He addressed his conversation to the family, but his attention, the real attention, the kind that has weight and direction, was on the corner of the room where Frances sat with her needle moving in steady, unhurried strokes. She did not look up. She did not need to. She could feel it the way one feels weather changing, a shift in pressure, in temperature, in what the air is capable of holding. When he left, Lady Hale turned to Frances and said, with the controlled voice of a woman standing at the edge of an understanding she did not want, "What have you done?" "Nothing, Mamma. I delivered your message. He poured me tea. I came home." "He looked at you." "He looked at everyone." "He did not look at everyone, Frances. He looked at you the way men look at the thing they intend to acquire." Frances set down her needlework. Her hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady. "I am not a thing to be acquired." "No," Lady Hale said, and her voice had something in it that was not unkindness, but was close to bewilderment. "No, you are not, which is, I think, precisely the difficulty." He called again on Thursday, and again the following week. Each time he was correct and courteous, and each time the center of his gravity was the corner where Frances sat, and each time Frances tried to make herself smaller in that corner, and each time she failed because he would not let her. He asked her to walk in the garden on the third visit. Lady Hale could see them from the morning room window, and this was judged sufficient for propriety, though Lady Hale watched them through the glass with the expression of someone witnessing an event she had not rehearsed for. They walked between the rose beds. Sir Gilbert's roses were his single vanity, and he asked Frances what she would do with the east field, which was fallow. And she said she would plant turnips for the rotation, and he said, "You are the most unusual woman I have ever met," and she said, "I suspect you have not met very many." "I have met a great number. They were none of them like you. They were none of them the second daughter sent to refuse you." "No," he agreed, "they were not." He stopped walking. They were beside the sundial, which was old and inaccurate, and which Frances had loved since childhood, because it was honest about its imprecision. It did not pretend to tell better time than it could. Miss Hale, you do not believe that my interest is real." She did not answer immediately. A thrush was singing somewhere in the laurels, and the late afternoon light was making the sundial's shadow long and thin across the gravel. "I believe that you came to this house expecting Lucinda," she said carefully, "and that I was not what you expected, and that the unexpected can be briefly interesting without being permanent. You think I am merely surprised. I think surprise is a poor foundation for an attachment. And what is a sound foundation?" She looked at him directly. She had nothing to shield herself with, no beauty to deploy, no accomplishment to perform, no careful presentation to maintain. She was simply herself, standing beside a broken sundial in a gray dress in the garden of a modest house, and this was either enough or it was not. "Knowledge," she said, "knowledge, and choosing anyway." Something in his face changed, not softened. He was not a man who softened easily, but settled, as though a question he had been carrying had found its answer, and the answer was exactly what he had suspected, but needed to hear spoken aloud. "Then let me know you," he said, "properly, completely, with your full knowledge of what I intend." "What do you intend?" "To choose you, and to keep choosing you, with whatever proof of permanence you require." She turned away because her eyes were doing something she had not authorized, and because his voice had landed somewhere in her chest that she had not known was unoccupied. The thrush sang. The sundial cast its honest, imprecise shadow. "You may call again," she said. He called again. He called twice the following week. He called so frequently that the village talked, and Lady Hale's friends called in return, not to congratulate but to inquire, which was worse. Sir Gilbert was confused and faintly pleased in the manner of a man who cannot follow the plot but recognizes that the ending may be favorable. Lucinda, who alone in the family had understood from the first visit, helped Francis dress for his calls without being asked, and brushed her hair, and lent her a brooch of seed pearls that had been their grandmother's, and said, "He sees you, Fran. Let him." The Tun learned of the Duke of Fenmore's courtship in the manner the Tun learns everything, imperfectly, indignantly, and with great speed. That he had offered for the elder Hale daughter and been refused was known. That he had then fixed upon the younger was incomprehensible. Lady Hale received 3 letters of condolence, as though Francis's courtship were a bereavement. The word plain followed Francis through drawing rooms she had never entered, spoken by women who had never troubled to look at her. Francis bore it. She had borne worse. She had borne years of being the daughter who was mentioned second, described briefly, and excused early. The whispers were not a new wound. They were an old one, reopened by unfamiliar light. What she could not bear, what kept her awake in the narrow bed of her narrow room, staring at the ceiling where the candlelight made shapes she could not interpret, was the growing certainty that she wanted him. Not his title, not his house, not the rescue from curates and solicitors in someone else's household. She wanted the way he listened as though her words had weight. She wanted the way he poured tea without asking. She wanted the steady gray-green attention that made her feel, for the first time in her life, like the first thing in a room rather than the last. And wanting it terrified her, because she had survived 23 years by not wanting things that were not meant for her. The ball at Ashwick House was the largest of the spring season. The Hales were invited because Sir Gilbert had once done the Earl of Ashwick a favor involving a boundary dispute, and the invitation was renewed each year out of a courtesy that had calcified into habit. Frances wore white muslin with a satin sash, her best dress, her only evening dress, made over twice and still merely adequate. Lucinda wore primrose silk and was, as ever, luminous. Lady Hale wore her anxiety like a pelisse, buttoned to the chin. The ballroom was bright with 500 candles in crystal chandeliers, and the heat of them and of the bodies below created a warmth that was almost oppressive. The Duke of Fenmore was there. Frances saw him across the room the moment they entered, saw him standing near the far wall with Lord Ashwick and 2 other men whose names she did not know, and saw him see her, and saw the thing that happened to his face when he did. It was not a smile. It was something more honest than a smile. It was recognition. He crossed the room. He did not hurry. A duke does not hurry across a ballroom, but his path was direct and his purpose was clear, and every pair of eyes between the door and the far wall tracked his progress. Lady Hale gripped Frances's arm. Sir Gilbert straightened his cravat. He bowed to Lady Hale. He bowed to Sir Gilbert. He bowed to Lucinda, briefly and with evident goodwill. Then he turned to Frances and said, in a voice that was not loud but carried the voice of a man who sat in the House of Lords and understood the architecture of a room, "Miss Frances, I believe the next is a cotillion. Will you do me the honor?" She danced with a duke in front of 300 people, and she danced well, because she danced without pretense. She did not try to be graceful. She did not try to be light. She was merely precise, as she was precise in all things, and he matched her precision with his own. And when the figure brought them close, he said quietly, for her ears alone, "You are the only person in this room I wish to see tonight." He danced the next with her, and the next. By the third dance the room had understood, and the understanding moved through it like wind through wheat, visible, directional, unstoppable. Lady Ashwick raised her lorgnette, Mrs. Ashdown whispered behind her fan. The word plain was spoken once more by a woman near the refreshment table, and Lucinda, who was standing close enough to hear, turned to the woman and said, with the sweet, annihilating composure that made her the most feared drawing-room presence in the county, "You will forgive me. I think the word you are looking for is remarkable." The woman did not speak again for the remainder of the evening. After the fourth dance, the Duke led Frances to the terrace. The night air was cool after the ballroom, and the garden below was silver with moonlight. "I have spoken with your father," he said. Frances felt the stone under her palms, cool, gritty, real. "When?" "This morning, before the ball. I rode to your house at 8 o'clock. Your mother was not yet dressed. Your father was in the garden with his roses and seemed, I think, relieved." "Relieved?" "I believe his exact words were, 'Thank God. I thought this would go on forever.'" Frances laughed. The sound surprised her. It was the same laugh that had escaped in his drawing room on that first morning, the laugh she had not recognized. She was beginning to recognize it now. It was the sound she made when she was not performing anything. Not usefulness, not plainness, not accommodation, just herself. "Miss Hale," he said. "Frances, I did not come to your house expecting Lucinda. I came to your house expecting a transaction, a sensible arrangement between families of appropriate standing. What I found instead was a woman in a gray dress who told me the truth about her sister, argued with me about soil drainage, and looked at my mother's garden and saw the bones of it. I have not been the same since. That was 6 weeks ago. I know how long it has been. I have counted every day. It is a new habit, and I find I have no talent for patience." She turned to face him. The moonlight made his features stark. The strong jaw, the dark hair, the gray-green eyes that had never once, in 6 weeks of calls and walks and conversations, wavered from her. "You could have anyone," she said. "You could have Lucinda. You could have any woman in that ballroom." "I could not have any woman in that ballroom. I could only ever have had you." "That makes no sense." "It makes perfect sense. It is simply not the sense you were taught to expect." She was quiet. Below them, the garden shifted in the breeze. Silver leaves, dark hedges, the white gleam of a marble urn. Inside, the orchestra began a waltz. "I am not what they will expect," she said. "I will not be the Duchess they imagined. I do not require the Duchess they imagined. I require the one who argues with me about turnip rotations and reads treatises on drainage and does not take sugar and will not pretend, not for society, not for my household, not for me. I have had enough pretense in my life, Frances. I should like to be finished with it." "Then ask me," she said. "Ask me properly. Not as a duke. As a man who knows me and is choosing me anyway." He took her hand. Her bare hand. She had removed her gloves again. She could not account for it. It was becoming a pattern. And held it and said, "Frances Hale, I know you, and I choose you. And I will keep choosing you every morning for the rest of my life, which I suspect you will make considerably more interesting than it has been." "Yes," she said. It was not a complicated word. She did not dress it in qualifications or conditions or the careful hedging of a woman protecting herself from disappointment. She said it the way she did everything, plainly, directly, with her whole self behind it. He kissed her hand. Then he led her back into the ballroom, and he did not release her hand as they entered, and 300 people saw the Duke of Fenmore walk through the doors of Ashwick House with Frances Hale's fingers laced through his and his expression entirely, unguardedly content. The engagement was announced the following week. Lady Hale wept, first from residual confusion, then from a happiness she had not thought to prepare for. Sir Gilbert shook the Duke's hand 4 times, and then excused himself to his roses, where he was later found among the damasks, with the expression of a man visited by Providence. Lucinda was the first to embrace her. She held Frances tightly in the hallway of their father's house, in the same spot where Frances had stood in her gray dress 6 weeks earlier preparing to deliver a message, and she said, "I always knew it would be you. I just didn't know what shape it would take. You could not have known. I knew because you are the one who never asked for anything, and the world has a way of finding those people, eventually, and giving them everything." Captain Aldous proposed to Lucinda before the summer was out. He did it in the garden beside the sundial, and Lucinda, who was perfect in every particular, wept with a lack of composure that would have scandalized the drawing rooms of 3 counties, and was the happier for it. The wedding was held at the chapel on the Fenmore estate, on a morning in September when the light was golden, and the lime trees along the drive had reached their full summer weight, and the stone of the house was warm against the sky. Frances wore cream silk, and she was not the most beautiful bride the county had seen, and she did not need to be. She was the most herself, and when she walked toward Lawrence Drayton in the chapel where his mother and father and grandfather had married, he looked at her with the same expression he had worn in the doorway of his drawing room on that first morning, the expression she could now at last classify. It was the look of a man who has found the thing he did not know he was looking for, and intends never to be parted from it. Mrs. Rowe, the housekeeper at Fenmore Park, had served the family for 21 years and had measured every duchess and every prospective duchess against the quiet standard of the late duchess, who had designed the parterre and loved the library and never raised her voice above the volume required to be heard. Mrs. Rowe measured Frances Hale against this standard and found her, to her own surprise, not merely adequate, but correct. The new duchess knew the house within a fortnight. She knew every passage and storeroom and the particular creak of the 3rd step on the east staircase. She met with Selby, the steward, on Tuesday mornings and reviewed the accounts with a precision that made Selby, a careful man himself, sit straighter in his chair. She walked the tenant farms and knew the families by name within a month, and when old Mrs. Duggan at the home farm complained about the drainage in the lower field, the Duchess of Fenmore said, "I have read a great deal about drainage," and Mrs. Duggan said, "Have you then?" And by November the lower field drained, and old Mrs. Duggan spoke of the Duchess with the particular loyalty reserved for people who solve problems rather than merely sympathize with them. Lawrence watched. He watched from doorways and across breakfast tables and from the far end of the gallery where she stood examining a portrait of his grandmother and saying, "She has your jaw." He watched her pour tea. She poured it the way he did, without ceremony, and this small parallel pleased him unreasonably. He watched her read in the library with her shoes removed and her feet tucked beneath her, which was not dignified, and which he hoped she would never stop doing. He watched her argue with the gardener about the pruning schedule and when, and he watched the gardener's expression shift from indulgence to respect, and he felt something expand in his chest that had no name but took up considerable room. In the spring, their first child was born, a daughter whom they named Cecily, and who had her mother's brown hair and her father's gray-green eyes and a disposition that the midwife described as decided. Frances held her in the bedroom where the morning light fell across the bed in long gold bars, and Lawrence sat beside them with his hand on his wife's shoulder and said, "She looks like you. She looks like an hour-old infant. She looks like you. She's already unimpressed with the world, and I find her magnificent." Lucinda came to visit when Cecily was 3 weeks old. She came with Captain Aldous, now simply Mr. Aldous. He had sold his commission and taken a living near Bath. The sisters sat together in the south drawing-room, in the same chairs where Frances had first sat with the Duke. "Do you remember?" Lucinda said, holding Cecily with the careful authority of a woman who intended to have children of her own shortly. "When Mama said you had done something." "I remember. She was right in a way. You had done something. You had walked into a room and been yourself, which is the most dangerous thing a woman can do because the right man cannot look away from it. That is not a thing I did. That is a thing I failed to prevent." "Precisely," Lucinda said, and smiled. 3 years later, on a Tuesday, it was always a Tuesday, the day that governed the rhythm of their story, Frances found Lawrence in the library with a letter in his hand. The canal bill he had been championing in the House of Lords had found its final supporter. Lord Grafton, who had called the proposal imbecilic the previous year, had changed his mind. "Because you were right," Frances said. "Because you were right. You told me to approach Grafton through his steward, who understands drainage and could explain the benefit in terms Grafton's pride could absorb. Then we were both right, Francis said, which is the ideal outcome and one I intend to repeat. He laughed. It was the laugh she had come to know as his real one, not the measured sound of the drawing room, but the unguarded sound of a man who is happy and does not trouble to hide it. The Duke of Fenmore's pride in his wife was not performed for society, but society observed it nonetheless. He deferred to her at dinner parties with a naturalness that made other wives envious and other husbands uncomfortable. He quoted her in conversation, not as novelty but as authority. When asked about his duchess by a visiting lord who had heard the story of the courtship and found it implausible, Lawrence said, "They sent her to refuse me. She walked into my house in a gray dress, and within an hour I understood that everything I had been looking for had walked in with her. I have not recovered. I do not intend to." The visiting lord, who had married for advantage and regretted it quietly for 11 years, said nothing. Frances kept the gray dress. It hung in the back of her dressing room at Fenmore Park, behind the silks and satins, and when she looked at it, she did not feel nostalgia. She felt accuracy. It was the dress she had been wearing when she was most completely herself, and it had been enough. On the anniversary of their first meeting, Lawrence placed a small package on her breakfast plate. Inside was a sundial, pocket-sized brass engraved with coordinates she recognized as the latitude of her father's garden. It was not accurate. He had commissioned it deliberately inaccurate to match the old stone sundial beside which she had told him that knowledge was the only sound foundation for an attachment. She turned it over. On the back, in his handwriting, engraved into the brass, "I know you. I choose you. Still." She set it beside her teacup. The morning light fell across the breakfast table in long gold bars. Somewhere in the nursery, Cecily was singing a song of her own invention, which had no discernible melody and considerable conviction. Outside, the lime trees held their full summer weight, and the parterre stood in its precise geometry, and the house settled into its grounds the way it had for 200 years, and would for 200 more. Frances poured the tea. She poured it without ceremony, the way they both did, and she did not take sugar, and he did not ask. They arrive here, like a door one almost walked past whenever they are ready.